So, I'm gonna open up, I'm just gonna hit create new. This looks just like Photoshop. When you hit create new, it will pop up with this panel, and then we can choose, you know, honestly it doesn't matter what size we work at because this is a vector-based program. You can work at any size and rescale it to any size. But it's good to work at like a standard size. It's just it's good practice to work at the scale that you think it should be. But really it doesn't matter as much, especially since we're just going to be doing textile designing in here. I'm still gonna make an 11 by 17 page because it's what we do. So if you go over to the print tab and choose tabloid, that is an 11 by 17 page, and you can change the units to inches. Right? You awake? We're learning a different program today, so I'm a little bit worried about you keeping up. This is Illustrator, okay? This isn't Photoshop. So this works differently. It's still by Adobe, but it's has differences, lots of differences. So we're making an 11 by 17 page, and I am going to bring in that file. I'm just going to drag it in. Boop. Okay, drag and place. And I actually already have my image trace panel open, but I'm going to close it for a second. Right now, this is a JPEG that happens to be in Photoshop. It's still that happens to be in Illustrator. This is still a JPEG, which is made of pixels, right? So if we scaled this right now, even though it's in Illustrator, it would get pixelated. We need to vectorize this in order to make it scalable to any size, and also in order to make it work a little bit better in the pattern design mode of Illustrator. So we're going to use image trace. And up here at your properties panel, when you launch Illustrator, it's actually probably going to be set to Essentials. And on Essentials, your image trace button is going to be on the right under the properties panel. I prefer and I recommend that you work on layouts. Layout makes Illustrator look the most like Photoshop, okay? So if you're just more familiar with Photoshop, layout is how you want to work. Honestly, Essentials seems to work better on like iPad Pros, like on screens. So maybe if you're working on your screens, you do want to work on Essentials. But if you're working on Essentials, anytime I talk about the Properties panel, which is this bar at the top, your Properties panel is going to be on the right. So in my Properties panel, I am going to hit Image Trace. And I'm actually not going to click this Image Trace button, but I'm going to click this caret next to it, and this gives me some preset options. So we're going to choose 6 colors right now and see how that looks. And this is going to reduce this artwork to only have 6 different colors in it. This is including the whites of the background. And it says it'll take a long time, and sometimes it takes like maybe a minute, and it would take a long time for a really large image. But if you don't need the whole image, you can always crop it before you use it. So
does creating less colors make image trace go faster or easier? Or
I don't know. Every time I think probably if you choose the the most number of colors, it probably takes longer, but every time I do it, it acts differently. So it's subtle, but could you guys tell that this image is a lot smoother now? It's very subtle. Okay, if I zoom in, you can see that this is no longer the brush strokes of the original image. I can compare it. Whatever. See how you can actually see the brush strokes of my gouache? And in the vectorized file, totally smooth. So now we have the option of adjusting this, and I am going to, I'm not going to do it too many times because well, you'll see, each time it has to think about it again. So the first thing I'm going to do is uncheck preview. If I don't uncheck that, then every time I adjust any setting, it's going to redo all that thinking it did where we had to pause for a second just then. So you want to uncheck that if you're going to make a lot of changes. So first off, just under like the presets and this first above section, if you have it set to be able to trace color, if you're on a color preset, or if you have the mode set to color, you'll have this color slider, and this adjusts the number of colors that it's going to kind of reduce this to. So you can go up to 30, but really we probably want, like maybe I would like to get an orange hopefully back in here, so let's try pumping it up to 9 or something. You can also choose to have the full tone available, and that's like if you were going to choose a preset like low fidelity photo or high fidelity photo. These are where they're trying to keep all the colors in there and make them a vector. So I've never used these. Like, it's very rare because I think it would probably take a long time. And I just feel like 30 colors ends up being enough for like the color palettes I'm using. And then these ones would be hard to edit as well because there would be a tiny like vector shape around every single color that you drew that was in there, all millions of them. So we're gonna try 9 colors, and I am also going to adjust some of how the paths fit. So let me zoom in. We are going to lower the path fitting, and if we hover over it, it even says that a higher value means a tighter fit, and we want smoother lines, or I do, it really doesn't matter. Smoother lines mean that they'd be easier to edit, so it's up to you. And less corners, that would also mean smoother lines. And then noise, this is for filtering out any like tiny areas, any specks of color. So like maybe like this speck right here, can you guys see it?
Yeah.
That might go away when we raise the noise to 100 pixels, but it might not, honestly, because it might be bigger than 100 pixels. I have no idea what the like pixel density of that picture was, or that scan. I might have scanned it really high quality. So now I'm going to hit trace. These methods, I can actually tell it to ignore white, which is kind of interesting. Let's try doing that because we don't need the white background. And I'm going to hit trace. So let's see if this dot goes away, and also the lines should get significantly smoother. Like this kind of, there's like a snag there, that'll probably go away. So it's going to take a minute though.
So now that you're ignoring white, will there be 9 colors excluding white?
Ooh, maybe. Yeah, more color bonus. I have never counted. I don't know. I'm always just trusting. Yeah. I'm like, it's a computer.
I was counting the colors when you had the full image. I was like,
Oh.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, because unfortunately there's 2 black colors, and that's kind of hard to avoid because like your brush strokes aren't going to be the perfect color all the time. Gouache is really good if you are going to reduce the color, because gouache, it's able to be painted with like really flat all the same colors, where like watercolor you would get like this huge range. So that speck did not go away, but like this is a little bit smoother overall. Anyway, and it did ignore, it ignored the background, which that's nice because now we don't have to go around and delete any of the white. So I am going to close this image trace panel because we're done with it. And right now this is still like its own little units. It's all kind of still together, stuck together. So we are going to hit expand up at the properties panel here. Expand, and this is going to make it into like separate units. Unfortunately, you still have to ungroup it if you want to like click on them separately. Like they'll still be grouped, but you'll see what I mean. Oh shoot, is Snagit recording the mic? It won't tell me. Ha! All right, well, I can always do a voiceover when I get home. Promising. I really should have checked. Oh, I can hit. Okay, so now you can tell it's all separate vectors because like when I hover over them, they're all highlighted individually and they've all got blue around them. But when I click on one, they're all selected. I'm clicking on them with the black selection tool, and the black selection tool, if you're a beginner, should be the only selection tool you use. You shouldn't use the white one at this point. The white one can select individual anchor points and make like individual adjustments. Like if I wanted to make this have a spike on it, I could grab this anchor point and drag it, right? But the black one selects the whole object. So if I want to move this shape after I ungroup it, object, ungroup. If I want to move this shape, I can move it all on its own. So I am going to select around some shapes, and honestly, it would have been better for me long term, especially since I use this all the time, to have a little bit more space in between each of the motifs I drew on here. Because when I click and drag a box around this, it's a little hard to choose like just the spells and not this black stuff over here. But you guys can probably use your own artwork, and if you do, maybe spread out your motifs or do one motif on each page and image trace each of them. But I'm gonna move the spell book, and I missed some stuff. I'm not too concerned about it, but I can go back in and hold shift and click on them to add more to my selection. And whatever I lost up here, not too concerned about. God. Okay. So I copied it so that I could, like, if I had caught any other pieces, I could just delete them over here. Getting them separated and then adding them to their own group, so object group. This is going to make things a lot easier in the long term. So I'm just going to grab that spell book and maybe the finger, okay, this guy, but not this. Group, and we'll also move that over there, and the cat. All right, Salem. I was watching, yeah, but I painted this before before the chilling adventures of this is Teenage Witch inspired.
Why not?
TV show on ABC.
Yeah. Oh man, it's been one of my favorite shows since I was 5, which is pretty extreme. I'll still go for a good Sabrina marathon. So I can clean this up a little bit, just like clicking on these and deleting them before I group him together. He's got a little like poop. All right, we'll leave the poop on his paws though. I don't want to spend a ton of time on him, but we will select him and then group. So let's bring, we're gonna kind of arrange these pieces in like a nice shape, maybe bring in a couple more, and then these gems and stuff can be kind of filler. It's nice to have some filler shapes that you can easily kind of use to get any holes filled, right? When you're arranging the pattern, if you see anything that you don't like. Okay, so we're gonna select all of this. You have to select the whole caboodle. And we are going to go to Object, Pattern, Make. Okay, so that's one to write down. Object, Pattern, Make. That's how you make repeating patterns in Illustrator. And this is going to bring us into another zone in Illustrator. It's going to be in the pattern design zone, okay? So everything that's on the screen right now is gonna disappear, but it'll come back, don't worry. Like, sometimes people panic. And also, when we're done designing this pattern and we hit OK, it is also going to disappear, which is also jarring, but the pattern is saved to your swatches. So when you go to define a pattern, I've probably checked off like, don't show this to me anymore. But when you go to do it, it will tell you, I'm adding this pattern to your swatch panel. So your swatch panel lives on the right, just like in Photoshop. And if we look really closely at this tiny swatch, I can actually make the view bigger, large thumbnail view. We can kind of see that there's like a cat-shaped splotch in that pattern, right? So that swatch is this pattern. How's everyone? Are we with me? Object define pattern. Now we can see the pattern. Feeling good? Okay. You stop me if you have questions, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do you have a question? No.
How do I start? Like, how do I start?
So, if you want to, you could just draw a couple shapes using the
so I
shape
can
tool.
Do whatever I want.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the rasterized image. I'm just kind of suggesting that you do it that way in case you don't want to draw in Illustrator.
So can I just like find a random image?
Yeah, for practice. But for homework, maybe doodle your own little drawing.
Wouldn't it be easier just to draw it in the pattern we wanted? Just scan it?
What? To draw the repeat? Like the whole...
No, just draw like the one panel.
Yeah, so you wouldn't have to arrange anything like I did. That's true, but sometimes it's nice to just like be like, I'm brainstorming, I'm drawing Sabrina the Teenage Witch stuff, and here we are, right? But for sure, if you wanted to like think about the composition before you started painting, that's true, that's great. One thing I will say, I'm gonna hit cancel for a second, is that if you are painting, like I've made a mistake here where I let this like shape go onto the edge of the paper, right? The original artwork that was like cut off on the edge. So now I have this hard line in this shape, and it would have been beneficial to like not go up to the edge of the painting, right? Because then you wouldn't have any hard lines. So keeping all your motifs in the center of the page. So yeah, you just select around whatever you want to make a pattern of. and then go to Edit, Object, Pattern, Make, sorry. Object, Pattern, Make. That's where it lives in Illustrator. And so what automatically pops up is your pattern options panel on the left. And first off, my patterns right now are dimmed to 50%, but I can uncheck this, and in this option panel down at the bottom. And now they're all the same. And what's great is that I can move these shapes around, and I can also adjust the size of the width and height of the tile, right? So if I want there to be less space in between the bottom of the cat and the spell book, I can lower the height of the tile. So let's try 5 inches. See? So it's very good. What's hard is that you can only click on one of them. Like, I want to adjust this so it's not touching the spell book anymore, but I have to come down here and click on this version of it because, like, if I dim the copies, you'll see that this is the one that's real. Also, you can't have any shapes not touching the edge of the tile. Like, if I drag this out here, it disappears. So all of your shapes have to be touching the edge of the tile. Say it again?
No, it's just really intuitive.
Yeah, so once you get in here, like, you could even, if you were good at drawing in Illustrator, which some of you I know, you know how to draw in Illustrator already, then you could just like grab the pen tool or the pencil tool or whatever, and we could start drawing shapes in here. Right? Give that a fill. And then there's instantly all the shapes. What I will say is that if you have especially an auto-traced artwork like I've recommended, they can end up with like a lot of data involved in them. Like if you were to take a photograph and auto-trace it and try to put it in here, or like a Mondrian painting, or like something with like a lot of like pointillism or a lot of texture, then this will run really slow. This isn't running slow at all right now because I only have probably like 500 anchor points in this altogether, right? Every single one of these dots is an anchor point, and each one of them is data that the computer has to hold on to. But if I had 1,000,000 anchor points, and then each time it repeats, it has to repeat each of those 1,000,000 anchor points. So then it's repeating all of them 12 times. So it's going to render 12 million anchor points. It just gets outrageous. So keeping it as simple as you can in here. I mean, you don't have to keep it like, you can draw more than a circle, clearly, but there's just a line. But it is good at what it does. So what do we think about this? Should I copy this guy over here, rotate him? I could actually change the color of the green if I wanted to. I could ungroup him and change it, or I can select the individual sections of the group with my white selection tool. And then you make sure that the fill is in the front, the stroke has a hole in the middle. But if the fill is in the front, then we can choose from another color. All right, try to get that green in there. There we go. So that's an option. You can also go to, if you have an object selected and you want to select all of that same color, like if I want to change all of the green, I can select one section that's green and then go to select same fill color, and it selects all the green, and then I could choose to change it all to light blue or whatever I'm doing.
Oh, because you switched it all to like the same 6 colors.
Yeah, then we're preserving the fact that we only have 6 colors. Yeah.
And it recognizes all of those instead of having to go and select.
Yes, that's true too. If we had chosen 30 colors, then there might be 10 different greens in there, and then it wouldn't work in that same way at all. Yes, great point. So, all right, I feel like this is pretty good. I am going to make it maybe a tiny bit thinner, so we'll try just 4 inches instead of like 4.5, and there we go. Everything looks nice and dense. I could maybe make this bigger, and because it's vectorized, I can make it bigger and it won't get pixelized at all. And maybe we should turn this so it's facing that way. I don't know. Nah, I'm gonna put it back. Okay, so once we are finished with it, we can hit done. And notice all the changes I made, like nothing has changed out here. This is still preserved exactly as it was when I went to edit define pattern. So how do we get our pattern into any artwork we're making? I'm gonna move these off to the side. I love Illustrator because you don't have to work on the artboard. You can work off in space on your work plane, which is just like the surface of a table. So I can move those off, and then when I export a JPEG, as long as I get the settings right, it will only export what is on this little section. So I'm gonna draw a shape, and it can be any shape. Like I have the star tool open right now, and I can choose my fill color. Make sure this fill is in the front. Okay, over here the solid one is in the front. This is the stroke color, and right now it's empty. There's no stroke on this. This is the fill. So we go to our swatches panel and we choose our pattern. And there it is. So let's put that on a rectangle that's the size of this artboard. There's our pattern. So what I will say is that probably the most straightforward way of getting this onto your artwork in Photoshop is to export this artboard. We can do it in many other ways, and I can talk about a more complicated way if you would like, but this artboard is 11 by 17, so I can kind of, if I know I want it to be pretty small on a piece of clothing that I'm illustrating, then I need to shrink this down. But we can do that in here, and then we just have to deal with the JPEG in Photoshop, and we wouldn't have to deal with like defining it as a pattern and making sure that we were exporting a seamless repeat and exporting the tile and all of that, which we can do. I know how to do it all. But let me show you what I mean. First off, we're gonna make it smaller, because right now, if I drew like a lady on here, the prints would be ginormous on her. Huh?
You would just see the kitty.
Yeah, and the kitty's face would probably be like on her boob or like end up somewhere really awkward, and like that's not what you want. So we are going to go to Object, Transform, Scale. And I have this shape selected. Now, if we just scale it as these settings stand, if I type in 50% up in uniform up here, you have to kind of click in. Okay, I actually don't have this selected, it seems like.
Can you hit preview?
That's what it was. I didn't have preview selected. Thank you, Mason. Object, Transform, Scale. If I type in 50% and check off preview, we can see that the rectangle gets smaller, but actually the pattern doesn't get smaller. The pattern stayed the same size. So what we need to do to just scale the pattern down is we want to check off transform patterns, right? Because first off, that's gonna make the pattern smaller. So there it is smaller. but then we uncheck transform objects. So now the rectangle is the same size and my pattern is small, half as small as it was. So maybe we even go a little bit further, 40%. Or 20. Let's see what 20 looks like. So that's probably too small. Oops, you don't want to change to non-uniform. You want it to scale uniformly. And I could also scale this in the other direction. I could type in 500%, and this is still like a correct scale. Like it hasn't gotten pixelated, right? Because it's made of vectors, is what I'm trying to say. So while it's in Illustrator, you can scale it to any size. Object, transform, scale, and then you uncheck transform objects, and you only want transform patterns checked. Okay. All right, so we are going to export just this as a JPEG. First off, I would want to save this as a Illustrator file, right? So we would want to save it as like, you know, Illustrator pattern homework or Sabrina pattern, whatever. TM. So an Illustrator file is going to allow you to open this up again and edit all of these vectors just as they are. I could come in and I could grab other places and make more patterns in this, but right now that's just like for backup, I guess. We want to export this to bring it over to Photoshop, which we're a bit more familiar with at this point. So instead of going to File, Save As, in Illustrator, in order to save it as an image file, you have to go to File, Export. So that's hard to remember. File, Export, Export As. I'm constantly going to File, Save As, like Photoshop, even still. And we want to save it as a JPEG is fine. A TIFF would also be good. It really doesn't matter. And I want to check off Use Artboards, okay? So if you don't check this off, I can show you what it would do in another example. But if you don't check this off, it would export the whole, like every piece of artwork I have on the file. So first off, we're going to check it off. And we are going to export a high quality image. And the resolution should be at 300 pixels per inch. If we exported a 72 pixel per inch image and brought it into our 300 pixel per inch file in Photoshop, it would be real small. It would be horrible quality when we tried to make it bigger. Right now we're turning the vectors into the pixels, right? File, export, export as, 300 pixels per inch, maximum file size. I like to choose no anti-aliasing because it allows you to change the color easier if you choose none. But that's a discussion for another day, and I'm gonna hit OK. So now we are going to bring it into Illustrator. Actually, I wanted to export another into Photoshop, but I wanted to export a couple other examples, 2 other examples. First off, we're gonna export a JPEG where we don't check off Use Artboards. And then I'm going to export a JPEG, or I'm going to export a PNG, because a PNG has the option of having a transparent background. Export, export as, and we're going to choose PNG. And this is going to come up with another export panel. Oops, I forgot to check off Use Artboards. File, export, export as, check off use artboards. We're trying to do a PNG right now. And I'm gonna hit export. And there it is, and we do want to indeed make sure the background color is set to transparent. And the resolution should still be 300 pixels per inch, high resolution. I like to turn off anti-aliasing. So let's launch Photoshop. I'm actually going to close Illustrator. And launch Photoshop. So let's look at those patterns that I exported while this is working. So it was in the other folder, and all right, this was the first one we exported, which is just the pattern, and we checked off use artboards, so it only exported that rectangle that we drew that was filled with the pattern. For this JPEG, we did not choose use artboards. Yeah, so there we have that star I drew, and then all of the artwork and like all of the work I did. And then the PNG probably is going to look just like the JPEG at this point. They're exactly the same, but when we bring them into Photoshop, we're going to see another side of them. An invisible background to the PNG is what we're going to see. So what should I'll just open up one of my illustrations at random, and we are going to drop in my image. And actually, this is only an 8.5 by 11 page, so things are going to be maybe a little bit bigger than we thought in here, or smaller, I guess. I don't know what I'm saying. They'll be different resolution-wise. So we'll first bring in the JPEG, drag it in there, and you can see we'll make it the top layer, and it'll cover everything. Okay, so let's shut off that layer. That's the PNG. And let's pretend that we've already given her skirt a color. So I'm actually going to try just using the paint bucket tool to fill in her skirt. I don't know if this is going to work. Sample all layers so it'll fill in no matter what. There we go. Let me cover this. Oops. What? So now we have this, and it's already filled with a color, and we want this to be the color of her skirt, but we designed on a white background in here. But because we exported that white background pattern as a PNG, when we drop this in here, we can see that even though this is the top layer, it doesn't have any background color to it, so I can instantly put it on her skirt. I also want to show you guys how I actually use patterns in Illustrator. I kind of showed you how to put them on your illustration really flat, where we would just select around her skirt, around the area that we want. Okay, so we have her skirt selected, and we are, I just had you kind of add a clipping mask, or the way I showed you, you maybe had to like rasterize the layer and then delete everything else, right? Select inverse and then hit delete, right? And this looks fine, but the pattern is really flat. It's subtle in this pattern, but if it were, I would have to do a little bit better selecting all the way up to the edge there. But if this were like a stripe, it would look really obvious. So we need to learn how to warp the pattern to to the garment. And the best way of doing this, I think the best way of clipping stuff to a garment is to actually use clipping masks. So clipping masks are more editable than just deleting the rest of the pixels that you don't need, right? So when you delete them, they're gone forever. But when you use a clipping mask, which is this little button at the bottom of your layers panel, the clipping mask is going to, it's going to choose, I'm gonna get these pixels too. It's going to clip it, but then preserve the rest of the pixels just like underneath the clipping mask. So I'm gonna have my skirt selected, and then I'm gonna click on this little button, which if we hover over it is called Add Layer Mask. So we're doing a layer mask. And we can see that this layer mask shows up here, and that hole is where the artwork is visible. But all the artwork is actually still here, right here. You can see that it still fills the whole page on this. So this looks like a little, is it the Japanese flag that looks like this?
Yes.
Yeah, so little Japanese flag symbol means add layer mask. So we are going to now warp it. First off, are you guys familiar with the warp tool in Photoshop at all? Ever played with it, anyone?
Does it have the X, Y, and Z axes on it? I feel like
Yeah.
I've delved into it
So,
once.
First off, I don't know if I've hit on this, but I'm going to drive it home now. Right now, this is a smart object. I dragged this file in. I didn't copy and paste it from somewhere. So this file is actually a link to a file right now. And I can tell that because it has this like little symbol in the bottom right-hand corner. And also because if I went to do anything to it, like if I went to use the eraser tool on this, it would give me this error message. This smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. So in order to rasterize a smart object, you need to right-click on the layer panel, on its layer in the layer panel, and choose Rasterize Layer. And now there's no symbol at the bottom, and these are editable pixels. So like if I went to use the eraser tool on this now, it would erase no problem. So let me shut off that layer. So, we were gonna use the warp tool. So if I go to Edit, Warp, Edit, Transform, Warp. There's two other warps there, Puppet Warp and Perspective Warp, and both of those are harder to use than Edit, Transform, Warp. So warp, edit, transform, warp. And now it's hard to see on this screen, but some handles have shown up on the outside edge of this.
Oh, yes, I have.
Yeah, so you can warp it using these handles and these points. But in Photoshop 2020, they made the warp tool so much better because now you can hold Alt. Let me hit Escape and go to Edit, Transform, Warp. And if I want to warp like this specific row of cats, I can hold Alt and put a handle there. And when we click on it, I can see it so much better on my screen. There are handles like here and here. Okay, so we are gonna use this let me hit enter, and it applied the transformation. And things will get pixelated, like if you stretch them really far, like I'm sure this is a little pixelated, it is. But it does its best, and it honestly does a good job. So we are gonna warp this so that this row of cats follows the bottom of the skirt, the curve of the bottom of the skirt. So I'm gonna zoom in. And we're gonna make sure we're on the right layer. And if we hit transform right now, edit, warp, transform, warp, and we tried to warp, what it does is it also warps the clipping mask or the layer mask that I have applied. So before we warp the layer, we have to unlink the layer mask from its background, okay? So right now it's linked. So if I went to move this with my move tool, if I went to move this, it would move the layer mask and the pattern at the same time. Now, if I unlinked this and went to move a cat with the move tool, it moves the whole shape. So first off, you can just get the placement of the pattern right. So let's say we like it with the cats at the bottom, pretty much where we were. And then we can go to Edit, Transform, Warp, and I'm going to hold Alt and add a warp anchor point right there, and I'm also probably going to add a warp anchor point at either end of the skirts. And then I'm going to raise these ones up and rotate the handles so they're going in the direction of the skirt, and I'm going to raise the middle one down. Right? You can also use your arrow keys to adjust the placement of these things. And then this doesn't look that great up here, so we can always try to finesse, or we could like bring this over. As the pattern bends around the body, the pattern will get tighter together, so I normally try to make the outside edges of the body have a little bit denser areas of pattern. And you try to keep it wider in the middle. And so I might even add more handles to spread out the middle further, and more on the edge to make it denser. Right? Yeah.
Are we gonna have to do this? Are we gonna draw like a bottom and a bottom?
Yeah. Like so last night for homework, you were supposed to draw an illustration and put a repeating pattern on it, but you were supposed to make a repeating pattern in Photoshop. And so tonight for homework, you're supposed to make a repeating pattern in Illustrator and bring it into Photoshop and put it on a drawing. And these are supposed to be production or portfolio ready drawings. So they should look, fully rendered, fully realized, like this, right? Where like the fabric is fully rendered. This is my pattern. I did this using this JPEG. I made a repeating pattern. I made that one in Photoshop though, but I've done plenty of fashion illustrations where I've brought repeating patterns in from Illustrator. I closed Illustrator already. So does that make sense how I warped it? You could do that with the pattern I made last class. If we wanted to warp that, we would probably go to Layer, New Fill Layer, Pattern. Okay, and then we can find the pattern I made last class from our little pattern menu, which was this daisy situation, and we'll make it smaller. We'll make it bigger than that though. Now we can't really edit this pattern. Like if we go to erase or like select a certain section and delete it, again, it says it's not directly editable, so this has to be rasterized as well. So raster means pixels, and rasterize means turn into pixels. Pixelize, essentially. Yeah, maybe it should be called pixelize. It would make my job a lot easier, not having to teach everyone this whole new vocab world, raster, raster and vector. It should just be called pixels and math, right? Vectors are made of math, Pixels are made of pixels. Rasters are made of pixels. Anyway, now this is a regular layer. So if I go to like select around it, I can hit delete. So a lot of times when I'm working, I actually leave one layer completely filled with the pattern, okay? And then I'll just only select what I need. So I need like a little box that's about this big. So I'll copy that, I'll turn off this layer, and then I'll paste the little box. And this is just like a much more manageable size. So that's always an option. You can always cut it down and then warp it, right? So I will add so I've selected the skirt, and I'm gonna add a layer mask.
This is so easy.
And
for
there it
colorways.
is.
Oh my
For
goodness.
colorways.
Like or different like patterns, like if you want
Yeah.
to see easily what it's gonna look like.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
No, honestly, I had heard of layer masks, but I had never used them in this way until a student at Mass Art insisted that this was the most editable way to use it, and it really is, because if I wanted to remove this layer mask, I can just throw it in the trash, right? And then I have the whole shape again. So and then you can unlink them, and you have to make sure that this is selected. Hi, you're good. You have to make sure there's like two thumbnails here, and this is the layer thumbnail, and this is the layer mask thumbnail. And on the layer thumbnail has to be the one that's selected when you go to edit, transform, warp. If you have the layer mask selected, it will transform the layer mask. So I'm gonna hit Alt and like add a few anchor points in the middle here, and then I'm just gonna adjust. Right? So since this one is really stripy, it's really obvious when it's super flat. And again, I like to kind of like make the edges have a little bit more pattern to them and make the outsides a little bit bigger. But you can always hit escape and start over. Like if things have gotten too wonky, you can just hit escape and try it again. And a lot of times, the first time I warp, it's like no good, because I'm like still trying to figure out the shape of the body, and I'm still trying to figure out like how the fabric would actually flow. The second time I come at it, it's like always so much better. So, God, this is a lame pattern I drew for you guys last class. What do we think? Do we have questions? Okay, so what time are we at? We can probably take a break until like 1:45 if you need to, and then for homework, I would love it if you, I could even give you this image of my Sabrina drawings, but if you practiced in Illustrator, turning an image into vectors and making a repeating pattern out of it. So let me throw this on the Moodle during the break, and you can use this if you want it. Okay, cool. Break time. Bye, internet.